Welcome to Radio Sofia. So Radio Sofia is a virtual platform to host discussions and debates on socioeconomic and political issues. It mainly aims to bridge the gap between researchers in different fields of social sciences and management through mutual sharing of knowledge and experiences. And it also aims to expose general public to a lot of academic debates, which are often taking place only within the spaces of universities, inside classrooms. So this is an attempt to bring it to everybody. And so today we have with us Dr. Ankur Barua from the Faculty of Divinity Studies, Cambridge University, to talk on a very interesting topic. So I will now hand it over to Himadri to introduce the speaker and moderate the session as well. So it's a great pleasure to have you, Professor Barua. So over to you, Himadri.
Okay, thank you, Kranti. Yeah, welcome everyone to today's session on a slightly contentious subject. Does God exist? Before I introduce the speaker, let me highlight the importance of today, the 16th of August. 74 years ago, on this very day, the city of the then Calcutta experienced one of its ghastliest communal riots, which continued for 4 consecutive days and led to almost 10,000 casualties, popularly known as the Great Calcutta Killings. Unfortunately, that tradition of communal tension continues even in the post-British era, leading many to question the necessity of a religion. And with religion being questioned, what came up for discussion was the visibly invisible force, or to some, the invisibly visible farce by the name of God. We at Radio Sofia were equally confused with this question on the existence or the inexistence of God, and decided to approach one of the most distinguished theologists, Dr. Ankur Barua, lecturer in Hindu studies from the University of Cambridge, to enlighten us on this issue. Dr. Barua's uniqueness lies in having traveled the path from science to religion during his academic pursuits. After a BSc in physics from St. Stephen's College, Delhi, Dr. Barua read Theology and Religious Studies at the Faculty of Divinity, Cambridge University. His primary research interests are Vedantic Hindu philosophic theology and Indo-Islamic styles of sociality. He calls himself a lecturer in all Hindu studies, that is, the study of religious concepts, movements, and institutions that have flourished in South Asia, that is Al-Hind. According to him, the question that grips his soul is not, is this Hindu, but is this happening on Al-Hind, South Asia? We are indeed privileged and honored to have you, sir, all the way from United Kingdom, and look forward to an enthralling session today. Professor Barua, the stage is all yours now. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I hope all of you can hear me more or less clearly. Madhuri, can you hear me clearly?
Yes, you are audible, sir.
Then I'm going to assume that everyone else can hear me clearly.
Yes.
So thank you for inviting me to speak to you today about the existence of God. Let me begin by saying that the theme of God's existence can be approached from multiple perspectives. To begin with, we could discuss whether the concept of God itself is logically coherent. Say, for example, we might claim that there is some fundamental inconsistency in the way in which God is characterized within a certain religious tradition. For example, we might argue that God cannot be simultaneously all-powerful and all-loving, given the sheer amount of seemingly pointless suffering that we see around us in the world. However, we might be interested not so much in the question of whether or not God exists, but in understanding how the belief in the existence of God intersects with complex sociocultural and socioeconomic institutions and movements. In other words, what Himadri was talking about just a few minutes ago. For instance, we might claim that because of the cosmological beliefs of a certain religious tradition, their adherents gradually lose their social conscience. Or we may claim that the theological frameworks of another religious tradition generate forms of violent hatred towards outsiders. Now, in my own teaching and research, I work at both these levels, the two levels I mentioned to you just now. For instance, over the last 4 months of lockdown, I have been studying how some Hindu and Muslim traditions conceptualize the nature of God and the human self, and also studying how and why Hindus and Muslims have cultivated towards one another forms of amity as well as antagonism. Nowadays, we often talk about the impact factor of academic research. Whether or not you are yourself religious, it is possible that there is no other question which has had a greater impact on human history than the simple question, does God exist? I hardly need to remind you that in the name of God, people who were once alien to us have become our brothers and sisters. And again, in the very name of God, people who were once our brothers and sisters have become alienated from us. Now, given that I have given myself only 45 to 50 minutes today, let me spell out very concretely what I will discuss. So here are the 3 points I'm going to discuss. Number 1, the concept of God. Number 2, the concept of rationality. What makes something rational? What makes a belief rational? And number 3, one set of arguments which seek to demonstrate that the existence of God has been conclusively disproved. Now, I'm aware that you belong to different existential backgrounds. Some of you are religious, some of you are non-theists, some of you are agnostics. Again, some of you may have studied a specific religious scripture such as the Bhagavad Gita or the Quran. Today, in the next 50 minutes, I'm going to aim not at breadth, but at depth. That is, instead of trying to give you a rapid fire introduction to 10 different big ideas, I'm going to give you 1 or 2 big ideas with which you can develop your own investigations later on. Therefore, I will not be discussing at length the understanding of God in a specific Hindu or Christian or Muslim tradition. My arguments will broadly apply across these 3 traditions. Finally, before we start, here is a very important health warning. It is possible that some of you have never had of listening to a philosopher. For the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to speak to you in the persona of a philosopher who does not answer the question, but in a very irritating manner, questions the question. Now, if you feel at times that the discussion is not going anywhere, that is partly because philosophical discussions are not meant to go anywhere. That is, go anywhere but invite you to critically rethink and reflexively interrogate your own presuppositions. So here is a joke about a philosopher. One day, someone called Amit goes to a philosopher and asks him, "Dear philosopher, what is the distance between Delhi and Bombay?" The philosopher asks Amit, "By Delhi, do you mean the Delhi in India and not the Delhi in New York? And by Bombay, do you mean the Bombay in India and not the Bombay in New York? Now, I'm not making this up. There really is a Delhi and a Bombay in New York. To which Amit says, yes. The philosopher asks again, and by distance, do you mean the shortest line between 2 points on a 2-dimensional surface? Amit says, yes. And then the philosopher replies, that is a very good question. Now, please go and speak to the town planner if you want an answer. So in the spirit of that extremely pedantic philosopher, let me begin. The concept of God is very nebulous, that is very vague. Some conceptions are personalist and some are transpersonalist. For example, I may believe that God is supremely more exalted than any human personality. So God is all loving, all compassionate, all just, and so on. I sadly report to you that I am not all compassionate. I would feel exhausted if I tried to be compassionate to more than 3 people on a Sunday afternoon. But God does not have a compassion machine or an engine that God keeps on switching on and off. God is supremely compassionate all the time. And that is what we mean when we speak in Christianity, in Islam, and bhakti-based forms of Hinduism, of a fully personalist conception of God. Now, some philosophical and spiritual milieux in India and in Europe are based on transpersonalist conceptions of divinity. Here the claim is that the divine reality is so categorically of another kind that we should not use any qualities whatsoever which are drawn from personalist human discourses. So, for instance, I should not say that God is all-loving, because who knows what I'm thinking when I apply the attribute of love to God? Perhaps I'm thinking of my grandfather who would get me chocolates when I pretended to be ill because I did not want to go to school. So as you can see, transpersonalist conceptions, such as those you find in Advaita Vedanta, call for this radical cognitive cleansing of all our human conceptions when speaking of or about the divine. About God, we can only say that God is, but not what God is. And the silence that remains is all there is to it. Now, from now on, I shall use the term God to encompass both personalist and transpersonalist conceptions. This fine-grained distinction that I posed to you some time ago will not matter too much for my arguments today. So that's conception number 1. So on that list of 3 things I'm going to do, the concept of God, the concept of rationality, and 1 set of arguments about belief in God. Now, number 2, the concept of rationality is equally nebulous, that is vague. There is one sense in which we are not being rational if we perform a logical contradiction. For instance, if I say that I am speaking to you right now, and also that I am not speaking to you right now, that is a logical contradiction. Beyond this basic sense, however, it is difficult to state precisely what counts as being rational. Consider this question. In the year 1350, almost everyone in Europe believed that the Earth is at the center of the universe. Were these Europeans irrational in holding this belief? Here is one way to answer the question. In the year 1350, the most advanced knowledge was a cosmological understanding derived from Aristotle. So these Europeans were not being irrational. However, today we know that their belief was not true. What this thought experiment shows, and this is the most crucial point for our argument today, that it is possible that a belief is rational even if nothing corresponds to that belief in the real world. Is your 3-year-old niece rational in believing in Santa Claus? The answer is yes, because you have not given her any reason to believe that you are not being truthful. That is, whether or not a belief is rational is partly a matter of the social context from within which that belief is formed and enunciated. More precisely, rationality is context sensitive. Now, to avoid causing disappointment to anyone, I'm going to lay my cards on the table at this stage and tell you what I will not do today. I will not prove to you that God exists. Frankly, I do not know what such a proof would even look like. However, here is what I will argue. Science has not made it irrational to believe in the existence of God. So that is going to be the claim from now on. Here is the central set of objections that we will explore from now on. The objection says that science has conclusively disproved the existence of God. We should not believe in God because science has made belief in God intellectually disrespectable. So let's start by looking at the two key words here, science and scientists. My personal sense is that when people generally think of scientists, the image that comes to their minds is that of very serious individuals wearing white lab coats who methodically get the right answer every single time. If that is the case for you, then you should befriend a real-world flesh and blood scientist and spend a few weeks with them trying to understand how the logic of scientific inquiry actually works. You will then see that the word science can be used and is often used in at least two different ways across the scientific community. And these are the two senses that we are going to operate with from now on. So science, so sense one and sense two. Sense one, by science, we mean a systematic inquiry into entities in space-time and the patterns of regular behavior that these entities exhibit. So a particular science, such as physics or chemistry, is a piecemeal, fallible inquiry into specific locations of space-time to gradually develop our theoretical understanding of how the world works through experimental investigation. Now, these theories are tested multiple times across different locations by different scientists through processes of what is called peer review. In this way, scientists gradually build up a map or a paradigm of theories and experiments, and this map may have to be revised either partly or substantially in the future. So everything I've said so far is sense one of what science is. Now here comes sense two. By science, we mean a categorical statement about what exists and what does not exist. More precisely, science in sense two is the claim that whatever exists can only exist within space-time. So as a matter of definition, nothing beyond the bounds of space-time is allowed to exist. So this is sense two. Now, while sense one is often conflated or confused with sense two and vice versa, there is no logical inconsistency in accepting sense one and rejecting sense two. That is, if a particular scientist claims to be pursuing science as an inquiry in sense one into the behavior of objects in space-time, and also believes in the existence of a God beyond space and time, what we do not have is a logical contradiction of the type we would have if I were to say to you, I am speaking to you right now and I'm not speaking to you right now. Now, to see why there is no logical contradiction in accepting sense one and rejecting sense two, let us distinguish between what I'm now going to call a methodological inquiry and an ontological inquiry. You that this is the only jargon I will use today. So sense one, methodological inquiry, and sense two, an ontological inquiry. A methodological inquiry is one where we clearly lay down the basic parameters of our inquiry, define the key concepts, spell out the fundamental rules of engagement, and agree on how much disagreement is reasonably acceptable on the field. However, and this is the crucial point, such a methodological inquiry is agnostic about what lies beyond or outside the field. It only makes existence-related claims about what lies within the field. Consider, for instance, the field of psychotherapy. If you go to a psychotherapist and say that you have been feeling unwell because the spirit of Julius Caesar has been speaking to you, then the psychotherapist, in her professional capacity as a psychotherapist, is not immediately concerned to either prove or disprove the existence of the spirit. But suppose I ask you a very different kind of question. Does the spirit of Julius Caesar really exist in your room right now? That sort of an ontological inquiry concerns what exists or does not exist. So, to return to science, sense one does not make any existence-related, that is to say, ontological claims about the spirit of Julius Caesar, about the Archangel Gabriel, or about the Hindu god Vishnu. Sense one is methodologically agnostic or indifferent. Perhaps there is an angel or God out there, or perhaps there is not an angel or God out there. Such questions do not turn up during an everyday lab experiment into the molecular structure of gold, any more than the question, do prime numbers exist, turns up when you are trying to pass a test for your driving license. In contrast, sense two makes substantive existence-related claims, namely, whatever exists can only exist within space-time. So let us now return to the question which is motivating this line of inquiry. Is it a logical contradiction if we accept sense one, which is methodological, but we do not accept sense two, which is substantive or ontological? A slightly different way of asking the same question would be this. Does sense two logically follow from sense one? If it is the case that when you affirm X, you cannot not affirm Y, then Y follows logically from X. For instance, what would you say to someone who says, I agree that Calcutta is to the east of Delhi, but I do not agree that Delhi is to the west of Calcutta? What could you say? Perhaps you will just shrug your shoulders and walk away down the corridor. So does sense two of science follow logically from sense one of science? And the answer, it should be clear to us by now, is that it does not. The reason to recapitulate our discussion is this: from a methodologically agnostic or indifferent line of inquiry, you cannot draw an ontologically substantive conclusion. So if your line of inquiry is simply about methodology, it is simply indifferent about what exists or does not exist. Say, for example, if you enter the University of Cambridge or Calcutta or Delhi, anywhere, with the intention of pursuing a postgraduate degree in astrophysics, you are not officially required to sign on the dotted line which says, only if you accept sense 2 will you receive your PhD degree after 3 years. Now, you may accept science in sense 1 and sense 2 and become recognized as a scientist at international forums, or you may accept science in sense 1 but not in sense 2 and again become recognized as a scientist at international forums. One example would be the Pakistani scientist Abdul Salam. We can now begin to see why science, understood in sense 2, is what we call a meta-inquiry. Meta-inquiry. That is an inquiry not about this being or that being that exists within a field, but an inquiry about the nature of the entire field itself. Suppose in response to the question, why do you watch so many Netflix movies? You reply, because I want some entertainment. Only to receive the subsequent question, why do you want some entertainment? You patiently reply, well, that is because I want to be happy. Only to be greeted with the question, but why do you want to be happy? I myself do not have a straightforward answer to that question, to that meta-inquiry. At least not as straightforward as the answer to the question, why do you read so many books about Hindus and Muslims in India? Now, if you think that only weird people called philosophers ask such meta questions, you should spend some time with little children. They are the most resolute and gifted meta-inquirers. If to the question, why do dogs have fur, you answer, because dogs need warmth. And you may receive the next question then, but why do dogs need warmth? To which you may respond, that is the nature of dogs. But now suppose you get the question, why do dogs have their particular nature? What would you do then? I myself would not know what to do. Perhaps I would regard that child as my academic peer without the official qualifications. So to return to science, as understood in sense 1, science will tell you that the atomic number of gold is 79. But science as understood in sense 2 is the categorically different kind of claim that only spatio-temporal entities like gold exist. Now, if that is so, why do we seem to be so inclined to believe that sense 2 is a fundamental requirement and a universal baseline of the scientific enterprise? And perhaps that is because we think that science, as understood in sense 2, has irrefutably disproved the existence of God. So here is our next question coming up. Has science understood in sense 2, irrefutably disproved the existence of God. Just when you might have thought that you will receive an answer to a most magnificent question, the irritating philosopher in me returns to ask you, what does it mean to irrefutably prove or disprove anything? Never mind God, science, these big questions, anything. Now we may think, before our minds get contaminated by philosophy, that it is very easy to irrefutably prove X, Y, and Z. So I'm going to ask you to think about this, and I'm going to ask you somewhat provocatively, how many things have you irrefutably proved in the last 20 years of your life? Let me assume that all of you have a sister. Have you ever irrefutably proved that your sister is not an extremely sophisticated robot constructed by a Russian company? In response to my query, you may say that you are certain that your sister is not a robot because she behaves in very human-like ways when she is with you. But of course, this response does not take you anywhere. Part of the claim is that the robot is sophisticated enough, is advanced enough to mechanically mimic human-like responses. If you directly confront your sister and ask her, sister, are you a robot? And your sister says empathetically, I am not a robot. That too would not settle the matter because the sophisticated sister robot could have been engineered to answer that question in the negative. And we can keep on doing this all day. If I happen to be the type of choosy person who sets the standard of proof extremely high, I will never be able to prove that my sister is a human being with an inner subjective life similar to mine. Here is another example. Have you or I or we irrefutably proved that the sun will rise the next day? You can begin by saying that there is no good reason why the sun should not rise tomorrow. But to invoke good reason is only to offer a subjective opinion and not develop a rigorous proof, which is what we want here. Many people, and I don't only mean physical cosmologists, may have equally good reason to believe that the sun will not rise tomorrow. And yet I assume that it has never been the case during the last 20 years of your life that you have tried to irrefutably prove that the sun will rise the next morning before falling asleep. Lastly, here is a slightly technical example. Did Newton irrefutably prove that the laws of gravitation that obtain on Earth also obtain on Jupiter when he proposed what is known as the universal constant of gravitation? After all, Newton never traveled even to India, let alone go to Jupiter to check this constant for its putative universality. For Newton and many other experimental scientists after him, the claim that nature is uniform across the universe is not conclusively demonstrated to be true after an experiment. Rather, it is assumed to be valid before carrying out the experiment. So in other words, the set of things, the set of claims that we can prove irrefutably turns out to be not very interesting. For instance, I can indeed prove irrefutably that 2 plus 2 equals 4. But how far does that proof take you? Now let's take stock of where we are at this stage of the argument and ask, where does all of this leave us? What I have been saying so far. Now, while we may not want to set the bar of proof too high, so high that we cannot even be sure whether a sister is a robot, we may not want to set it too low either, so low that we believe that the reason why we feel hungry is because a unicorn is dancing in the garden. So what I want to do is to reach a cognitive equilibrium between being gullible, for instance, believing that my sister is the wife of the archangel Michael, and being cynical, for instance, not believing that my sister is a human being. So get ready for the next question arriving on the conceptual horizon. Who gets to decide precisely where this cognitive equilibrium should be set? That is, who is the properly qualified cognitive authority who determines that just this amount of belief is the right amount, 3.8, not 4.2. Nothing above and nothing below this mark is acceptable. Or to return to our discussion about little children, is there a logical way of determining precisely when a child has asked one question too many? Now, such questions do not have quantitative answers, which could be arrived at through precise algorithmic procedures. And yet, we take such cognitive decisions throughout our lives, and sometimes several times across one day. So when John says, "I do" to Margaret at a Christian wedding, and Margaret says that she believes that John is being sincere in his expression of vows, is Margaret believing just the right amount? Who can say right there and then? Only time will tell. So let us summarize our discussion so far. Science as understood in sense 2 does not logically follow from science as understood in sense 1. Or more precisely, there is no direct logical step from science to irrefutably disproving God's existence. What about developing an argument in the reverse direction? Is there a direct logical step from science to irrefutably proving God's existence? Now, the good news or the bad news, depending on what you want to hear, is that it is no. There is no direct logical step from science to irrefutably proving God's existence. For the same reason that science, as understood in sense 1, cannot disprove God's existence, it cannot also prove God's existence. But what about science as understood in sense 2? Can it prove God's existence? Now, even before what we today, that is in the year 2020, call science, that is the type of experiment-shaped and mathematically modeled inquiry that was developed by European figures such as Newton, Galileo, and many others, even before this science arrived on the scene, various philosophers and theologians, some so-called proofs for the existence of God. According to one famous argument known as the teleological argument, When I look at the world around me and see how wonderfully the different parts constitute a seemingly harmonious tapestry, I should conclude that this world must be the handiwork of an omnipotent intellect. More precisely, because there is genuine order in the universe, therefore there must be a God. Now, the reason why I added the qualifier so-called, when I say so-called proofs for the existence of God, is because there is today a broad consensus in philosophical circles that the teleological argument does not have what is called deductive necessity. And this is what that phrase deductive necessity means. If it is true that Delhi is to the west of Calcutta or Kolkata, then it is a matter of deductive necessity that Calcutta is to the east of Delhi. But it is not a matter of deductive necessity that if I observe genuine order in the universe, there must be a God who has created this order. For instance, I could claim that the very nature of the universe is such that it can spontaneously generate this order without any divine impetus or assistance. There is no logical contradiction in asserting that there is indeed order in nature, and also that this order is spontaneous or intrinsic to nature. That is to say, science as understood in sense 2 cannot irrefutably prove God's existence and cannot also irrefutably disprove God's existence. Now, if you happen to be a religious believer, all this may sound like very bad news. But in truth, it should not be bad news at all, because religious traditions place a very strong emphasis on the cultivation of a volitional dimension when you speak of faith. Now, we often speak of a leap of faith in these religious contexts. There is a grain of truth in that phrase, but this phrase has also generated a lot of misunderstanding about the subjectivity of religious believing. The grain of truth is this, that the leap is indeed the distinguishing factor across the subjectivities of John, who looks at the sky and sees only the sky, and Margaret, who looks at the sky and discerns the work of the creative God. The misunderstanding is that the phrase leap of faith tends to represent religious believing as completely distinct from, or even as opposed to, our everyday ways of believing in everyday things. This misunderstanding is based on the assumption that in everyday ways of belief, we do not make any cognitive leaps. However, as we have seen, this is not the case. Every time we accept that my sister or a sister is not a robot, or we go to sleep without worrying about whether the sun will rise the next day, or we believe that the flight of airplanes above New Zealand is subject to the same natural constraints that regulate the flight of airplanes over Canada, we are making cognitive leaps. It is because these leaps have become so vitally fused into our everyday ways of being in the world that they usually go unnoticed. Again, if people were not willing to take such leaps, they would perhaps not get married in the first place. It may seem cheesy to characterize the religious life as a love affair with God, but in many ways, the venture of marriage is analogous to the venture of faith in God. I consciously use the word venture to highlight the analogy that relates to the subjectivity of risk-taking. when John and Margaret get married, they do not quite know how the whole thing will work out 30 years later. In this sense, marriage is not a ready-made template which provides all the answers one morning, but a volitional commitment to steadily work out the answers. Again, just 3 days ago, I read a newspaper report where the headline was, "For parents and teachers, sending children back to school will be a leap of faith." Likewise, while the life of religious faith is sometimes regarded as a non-rational or anti-rational fantasy, it should be seen as a volitional commitment to keep on finding better ways of being in the world in the light of certain cosmological visions which are said to have been inspired by the divine reality. Having said all of that, I should also note that every analogy has a disanalogy and reaches a point when it begins to break down. In the case of one individual and a sister, or one individual and a spouse, we are speaking of two finite beings within space-time. So call this kind of a leap a horizontal leap within space-time. However, in the case of one religious believer and God, we are speaking of one finite being within space-time and a non-finite being that is not within space-time. And call this kind of a leap a vertical leap across space-time. We can now see why the belief in the existence of God can be far more cognitively and experientially demanding than belief in a sister's humanity. Given this existential difficulty, we may ask, does anyone have any good reasons to believe in God? In the light of what we have been saying so far, or I have been saying so far, you can see why this seemingly simple question is difficult to answer in a straightforward way. Because we would have to ask in response good reasons as measured or assessed by whose standards? As we have seen, there is no objective calculus which would dictate with quantitative precision when a reason becomes good and when a reason becomes bad. Now, if I set up a calculus which says, I do not believe in the existence of anything that I cannot perceive right now with one or more of my 5 senses, I would have to conclude that Australia does not exist because I am not sitting there right now. Microorganisms do not exist because I am not looking at them through an electron microscope right now, and so on. Now, suppose you object to my calculus by saying, although right now I am not sitting in front of an electron microscope, in principle, I can look through an electron microscope tomorrow when I return to my lab. But you can never experience God, even in principle. Now, I should put my cards on the table and tell you that, for better or for worse, I am not a Hindu guru. Suppose I were a Hindu guru, I would respond to your objection by saying, says who? Says who that you can never experience the presence of God, even in principle? If you come and sit at my feet for 10 years, then I will initiate you into the spiritual discipline, sadhana, through which the existence of God will become transparently clear to you. As I move towards a conclusion, the next 3 minutes, let me give you a concrete narrative. A young Hindu woman whose name is Anamika and who meets a Hindu guru in Allahabad, which I think is called something else now. As she listens to the guru's sermons on the Bhagavad Gita, she begins to realize that she had always carried within her a deep spiritual emptiness. After several years of contemplating on these sermons, she develops a steadfast confidence in the theological vision of the Bhagavad Gita. Today, she believes that the Supreme Lord of the universe is intimately present in her very self. So that is the narrative I gave you just now. Now consider this question. Does Anamika have good reasons to believe that God exists? And this is my summary of what I've been saying for the last 45 minutes. In this talk, I have argued that science does not rule out Anamika's belief in God as irrational. However, and this is the crucial however, to repeat the point that I made towards the beginning of this talk, it is one thing to show that a belief is rational, and it is another thing to irrefutably demonstrate that the object of that belief really exists. Therefore, this assertion that God exists should be understood in terms of a personal venture of risk-taking in which one stakes one's life on the claim that the world indeed conforms to a scriptural text or a saintly individual. Suppose I am a devout Roman Catholic with 4 sisters. I'm not, but one can always suppose these things. Tomorrow, one of my sisters dies. Will that event in itself make it irrational for me to believe in God? No. There could be all kinds of reasons for the suffering that I am undergoing. Perhaps I have been spending too much time reading books and not thinking about God at all. So God, who is more worried about my spiritual health than about how many books I read, is giving me the opportunity to turn my thoughts towards God. Now suppose after 6 months, I lose another sister and you pose these questions to me. You are frustrated and you say, precisely how many sisters would you need to lose before your belief in God becomes irrational? As we have seen today, the answer is that this question has no quantitatively precise answer. Any answer I give you will be logically arbitrary. For someone, it may be 3 sisters. For someone, it could be 2. For someone, it could be 4. So, why is it the case that some of us are able to take up this venture of risk-taking with firm existential commitment? Some others reject this venture with firm existential commitment, and some others remain uncertain about whether or not to give their existential commitment either way. Suppose we define the word God to mean an omniscient being. Then the answer to my final question, which I asked just now, is God only knows. Only God, that is this omniscient being, can read into the minds of every human being and understand how, from within the crucibles of our psychobiographical experiences and rational inquiries, we arrive at different answers to one of the most significant questions of our finite existence. Does God exist? And that is the note on which I'll end. That's for Madri. Do you hear me? Hello?
Himadri, hi.
Yeah.
Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, so I'm done for now.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, sir. I mean, that was an extremely intense and insightful session. By the list of questions we have received, I think we've understood why you said at the beginning that you might end up not answering the question, but actually question the question itself. So we have a host of questions. I'll just go one by one. Yeah, Akash's question He asks, could it be implied that the existence of God is like a Schrodinger's cat problem?
So the quick answer to that question is yes. I say the quick answer is because the long answer would be I will first need to check that Akash and I are on the same page when we are talking about Schrodinger's cat equation. But assuming that what Akash means is that there is this kind of fundamental ambiguity in the structure of nature, so that the world is religiously ambiguous before we get there, then I would say that is the analogy I was trying to highlight when I say we take a risk and I say this is the view that I'm going to accept. I may not always know with absolute certainty. That is,
Okay.
you know, it's like saying unless you do it, you don't know it.
Okay. Next up, Rajat has a question. Is God inconceivable? What is your view on that? And he further adds, what is the way to God? Is it philosophy or science?
Well, you know, these are, hearing these questions make me feel very daunted, because, you know, one can go on and on answering these questions. Because, say, what is the conception of God? I would say that in one very fundamental sense, if God is not in space and time, then we have this deep paradox about how to use human language to talk about that which is not in space and time, because all our human language is equipped to talk about finite entities. So I talk about the green apple, which is not a blue apple. I talk about blue apple, which is not a brown cat. But if God, by definition, is not in space and time, cannot be localized in that way, God is inconceivable. But here is the paradox. God cannot be so utterly, completely inconceivable that we cannot say anything about God. Then there is no difference between religious belief and non-theism.
Okay. Paras asks, the positivist science does not even seek irrefutable proofs. We never prove anything irrefutably in the science today. Science operates in the realm of probability, with the opportunity to discard the current proposition already, always built in the process of doing science today. I think it's just a statement by him. If you want, I think if we can allow Paras to actually
Yes.
raise the question straight away.
Can you unmute your microphone?
Can you unmute? Yeah.
Yeah, hello. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, audible.
Yeah, so a very interesting talk indeed. I had a couple of comments on the talk, and I just wanted to understand what your perspective on these comments are. One, you know, he
Paras, I'm sorry to
said
interrupt you. Can you quickly
Hmm.
introduce yourself?
Oh, okay, yeah. So I'm a PhD student at IIM Calcutta, and I have my bachelor's and master's degree in psychology. So that's my brief background. So my, you know, it's a twofold question, two comments rather. The first comment is, you know, you stated that science cannot irrefutably prove or, you know, in some sense disprove, you know, the existence of God, right? To that, you know, my brief comment would be that science today, at least, you know, the post-positive science that we know, does not even seek to irrefutably prove, you know, existence of any particular object, because saying that, you know, it is an irrefutable proof is against the very spirit of post-positive science, right? You always keep the opportunity to discard the propositions open into the process of science. So that's one. Second, and this is a general question, right? And this springs from you know, Bertrand Russell's teapot analogy. Now, I'm an agnostic, by the way, and I think this teapot analogy does some justice to, you know, the frequent claim that, you know, we should disprove God or prove God. Isn't that shifting the burden of proof? Because, you know, when you claim that there exists a God, you know, the burden of proof to prove that God exists lies on you, right? Now, as you said, there is a deep paradox because you know, the God operates beyond the space-time continuum, and so it's very difficult for us to, you know, seek proof or even, you know, demonstrate the proof of God. So how would you respond to these two questions? One, the very nature of science that we see today operates in the realm of probability. We've seen quantum physics, we've seen neuropsychology, right? In the advances in science today, we never seek irrefutable proof at all. We know that we are operating in the realm of probabilities with truths which are tentative. These are tentative claims with the probability of rejection already inbuilt. And second, the argument about burden of proof which comes from Bertrand Russell. So those are my two comments rather.
Right.
Dr. Barua, I mean, a question very linked to the question asked by Paras is by Akshada Krishnan, who asked, quantum experiments have proven that an objective reality doesn't exist. It also states reality is what you want it to be. What is your take on the matter?
Yeah, so regarding the first one, I'm totally with you on the same page. When I was trying to think about how high or how low should I pitch my talk at, I was simply going on the assumption that people have not read things like Thomas Kuhn, they are not familiar with post-positivist philosophy of science. And I agree with you that today science has moved away from epistemic certainty. We talk about probability, we talk about hypothesis, we talk about conjectures. I had in mind a certain kind of person who thinks that science has irrefutably proved or disproved things. So if you are not that person, my argument is not directed at you. Now, regarding the second question, yes, I would be, I'm more or less in your epistemic circle here. That even, let me begin by saying, it is always, it's not always clear about who carries the burden of proof. When you have a disagreement, does the plaintiff or does the accuser carry the burden of proof? So in this case, is it the case that a religious believer is making extra claims? Because if you say that the religious believer is making extra claims, that extra is by whose standards? Not by the standards of the religious believer. It may be extra by your standards, and then the burden of proof could return to you. However, I am also sympathetic towards the claim, towards the view that religious believers who talk about things which are not in space and time have some kind of an epistemic burden to explain why we need to invoke these things which are not in space and time. And to go back to the question about quantum mechanics, there are various readings of what is happening at the level of quantum physics. The question is whether somehow macrocosmic reality comes into being when we observe it. This view, as it so happens, is a minority view. It's quite an influential view, but it is a minority view in the scientific community. So there are alternative readings of quantum physics. The reading that you're proposing is this idealistic reading of quantum physics, which says that things do not really exist before a conscious mind comes along and cognizes it. If that is true, if that is really happening at the fundamental level of reality, in one way that will only reinforce my arguments today, that it is not the case that macroscopic reality is the final word. But that's what I say for now.
That answers the question. We have Mani Rahman, who is a research scholar at the Presidency University, whose question is, does the existence of will and consciousness inevitably prove the existence of God?
So one way to answer that question is to go back to what I was saying. And I was telling you that there is no logical contradiction in claiming that the natural domain has its own self-consistent internal logic. So there are various arguments from the existence of mind and consciousness to the existence of God. So here is the analogy that just as I'm a human mind, there must be a supreme cosmic mind. To which one person, one kind of philosopher could respond that the natural domain of space-time beings is such that it possesses the capacity to spontaneously generate will and mind. So there's no argument from the mind of a human being to the mind of God. It could be the case that the universe we live in is such that it is packaged with the capacity to generate mind and will. So my answer would be that one would have to see the argument, how good the argument is, but there's no direct logical step from the human mind to a cosmic mind.
Yeah, I think there's one user wants to ask a question directly.
Okay, it's fine, yeah.
Yeah, who is that? Could Kranti please, could you unmute
Yeah,
him?
I have asked
or
him
her?
to unmute the user. Hi, yeah. Please go ahead.
Hello, Dr. Barua. Good evening.
Yeah, go ahead. I can hear you. Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. Dr. Barua, good evening. It was interesting hearing you, although I joined late. And sincere thanks to Himadri for the invitation. It was really nice listening to you, your deliberations, and I really liked your
Sir, could you
proposition.
please give your introduction once?
Yeah, my name is Dr. Arunaho Narayan Mukherjee. I'm a professor and corporate trainer. I would like to use the word trainer itself, not corporate that much. And I have been associated with the profession of human resource for about last 23 years. This is what I am. As I was telling, I was with a keen interest. I was hearing you, and I really liked your deliberation, particularly the point that believing in a God is a personal venture of risk taking. Very interesting. But I would like to ask a very simple question because I firmly believe in the philosophy of Vivekananda. That is there any, and of course, Ishwar Chandra Vidyashankar, is there any justification of God, the study of theology, the cultivation of theocracy? I mean, the way we are doing it, although it sounds very interesting, unless and until we understand the plight of human beings. If we don't understand human beings, what is the justification of understanding God? I mean, is there any existence of God beyond humanism, whether be it in any form or shape? Unless until we are the believer of humanism, we don't have the, today, particularly in the era of Corona and the pandemic, it's more evident that unless and until we feel for each other, there is no point. There is no point in relying God, or there is no point in relying in supernatural, and there is no, allow me to say, to have this wonderful theoretical discourse online on God itself, because if God exists, it has to have some humane, H-U-M-A-N-E, humane implication. That is what my take is. Please, I'm sorry if I have been a bit harsh in putting my points, but that is what I understand, and my question is.
No, I don't think you have been harsh. In fact, that is my view as well. If I have not been discussing the more anthropological dimension of religion, this is only because, as I said in the beginning, I have some very specific targets here, 3 concepts and 45 minutes. So when I say God, I have not assumed anything about the nature or the structure of God. Possibly what you have in mind is a God who is disconnected from humanity. But nowhere in my talk did I say that God is disconnected from humanity. I would say theology and anthropology are so deeply interconnected that the two are reciprocally illuminating each other. So the only way to do theology is by understanding our human condition, which develops, through which we develop our theological understanding. So while I did not endorse your viewpoint in my 45 minutes, now I'm endorsing it.
Thank you so very much. I stand reinforced. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So, Mr. Giri Krishnan, who happens to be another HR practitioner, he asks, what is your opinion on the origin of the universe? Big Bang, or is it a supernatural force? Could rationalism go beyond the current paradigm of empiricism? Is his second question.
Yeah, so, part of my deliberations and discussion was just to try to show how, before we get to the answers to these questions, we have to think through the concepts that we're using. So for example, when you say, can the current paradigm go via rationality? First, we have to agree on what is rationality here. What is empiricism here? You and I could have different definitions of empiricism, and I can answer yes or no. And it may be the case that we have not had a substantive argument because we have not spelled out what these terms mean, right? That is to say, before we arrive at an answer, we need to be certain that we are asking the same question.
Right.
So to go back to your question, is it the case that the universe emerged out of some kind of a primordial Big Bang within space-time? Or does this primordial Big Bang itself require some kind of a divine impetus? What I've tried to show here is the most common baseline on which we could possibly agree, is that neither view is immediately non-rational. These are two rational viewpoints we can hold, that the universe has this divine impetus or the universe does not have this divine impetus. Neither view is straightforwardly irrational or anti-rational.
Right. So we go back to Akash, who's actually a doctoral student at IIM Calcutta. He also asks, what is truth? Are there parallel realities or truths? Is reality the same as truth?
Yeah, so that again is a very interesting and a very, very difficult question to answer. I would say that the concepts of truth and the concept of reality, they're very deeply entangled, but they're also conceptually separate. And that is precisely why, as I said in the beginning, we can argue that certain views, beliefs are rational or irrational, independent of whether they have a referent. So to give you the example that I was using, if your 5-year-old niece or nephew has a belief that there is Santa Claus, that is truthful for that particular individual, even though we know that this belief called Santa Claus does not have a real world referent. And that shows that the concept of truth and the concept of reality, that is the concept of what beliefs we form and the concept of whether these beliefs that we form are world oriented or not, you cannot separate them materially, but conceptually you can. So are there alternate universes? Are there parallel universes? In fact, is there a parallel universe right now where I'm not speaking to you, but all of you are here? One will have to carefully work through the logical implications and see if it generates any contradiction or any inconsistency.
I think we are done with the set of questions. I mean, if there are any more,
There's
who's interested to ask?
one last question.
Yeah,
Manatri.
Oh, one more question? Okay.
Somebody
Okay,
posted
Rajat,
yeah.
yeah, can we assume that truth is always within the domain of our sensory perception?
Yeah, so you can assume it, but you cannot prove it. Yeah, okay. You can assume it. I mean, anything can be assumed. There's no problem. But the question is, can you prove it? That's the point.
Right, right.
I think Paras has one clarification.
Clarification. Yeah. Paras, go ahead.
Yeah, hello. Hi, sir. So throughout this talk, we have been very careful not to elucidate the characteristics of God. We have not tried to define the nature of God, right? Now, and yet we have tried to engage in an inquiry about the ontological status of God and debates about it. Now, my simple question is, and this is one of the dilemmas that I always have, while I'm discussing or debating the existence of God. How can we debate or discuss, the ontological status of God without even knowing, what God is, right? Because the moment you say that God is omnipotent or God is omniscient, you are defining God. You're putting a name to it. You're defining the characteristics of God, and then I think the debate can proceed. But without even defining God, right, or what we are debating in some sense, and how does that work out, or what is your personal take on the nature of God? I'm quite sure you would have some take, but what is your take? I would like to know that, because in this entire 45 minutes we are debating about God, but we are not pinning down on what exactly God is. And I'm asking this question because the moment we do that, the moment we pin down the nature of God, we enter into all sorts of arguments. Just to give one simple example, it could be the trilemma which Epicurus pointed out, right? If God is all powerful, then why is he not able to prevent evil? Something of that sort. So such arguments would then start flowing in once you pin down the nature of God. So that's one last clarification question which I have.
Yeah, so it is not quite true that I did not bring up the concept of God. I did in the beginning. So what I offered is a formal definition of God, not a substantive definition. And by this I mean a substantive definition will tell you something about what God is. And this cannot be generated in the abstract. This you will have to read the Quran or the Bible or the Upanishad or some particular religious scripture. I gave a formal definition that would broadly apply across many religious traditions. And formal definitions are usually through the so-called negative way. What is not A, what is not B. So a formal definition of God would be simply something which is not in space and time. So this is not finite. Anything that is not bound to finitude will be this abstract concept which is not localizable in time and space. And we can carry on a conversation up to a certain point with this concept of God, who or what is not localizable. Now, if you want a concrete argument, then there is no other way but to take up the understanding of God in a specific religious scripture.
Okay, we'll take the last question, and this is from MR, who asks, doesn't the dependent universe necessarily require an independent entity for its existence?
So when you ask a question like that, does a dependent universe not require something else? You are what is called begging the question. You are already assuming that the universe is dependent. So you have packed the answer into the question.
Right. I mean, I think we're done with the questions, and thank you very much, Dr. Barua, for this very, very fascinating session. Finally, I just wanted to ask one question that I had in mind. What is your view on the need for a form in worshipping God? The need to have a form.
Well, again, I mean, one has to be clear about this question. You say need. Why do you use the word need there? I mean, is there a need?
Yeah. So that's the question. Is there a need for a form in God?
So if by need you mean some kind of a need or some kind of a necessity, then it may be too strong. But if by need you mean it is part of our human condition that we are finite beings in space and time, and it is impossible for us not to use images, not to use forms which are located in space and time, it could just be the case that this is just the human condition. But the question now is, does the nature of the non-finite adequately reflect what we need? So whether we can construct an argument from human need to the nature of divinity.
Right. Thank you.
So whether we have a need, I don't know, but it is definitely the case. It is very difficult for us not to operate with forms.
Okay.
Because I mean, you will have some religious philosophers who will say, well, I agree there is a need, get rid of that need.
Right. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Barua. I mean, thank you for being so patient and sparing your time in answering all the questions and details. We really enjoyed the session and hope to see you again on one such, another session of on Radio Sofia on something even more interesting sometime later.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, next time we can talk about more anthropological issues, as someone pointed this out. Yeah. So it has been good to speak to you. It's a good exercise for me also to clear up my thoughts and work out certain lines of argument.
Yeah, right. So now I hand it over to Kranti to finish off the proceedings.
Okay.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Dr. Barua. So you accepted our invitation at a very quick notice. You went. So this talk has been really fascinating, and it addressed a lot of our questions, how to approach the issue, and it raised many more questions, and I think which will keep us hooked to this question for many more days to come. So thank you very much, everybody in the audience who have attended. We had almost 40 plus audience on and off. So, and this talk will be uploaded on Radio Sofia YouTube channel, and it will also be shared on the social media platforms of Radio Sofia, such as Facebook. So, thank you very much, and please keep joining us for many more talks that are coming to become in the future. Thank you very much, Professor Barua, for joining us.
Okay, bye-bye now.
Bye-bye. Bye, everybody. Yeah.